Hey, deserving listeners, it is time for part 3 in which I react to the video of Dr. Drew interviewing Trisha Paytas. Let's get to it.
I always don't want my parents, because I've talked about this recently and everyone's like, well, your parents should be in jail and all this stuff like that. And I was just like, I just don't want anyone to like get hate about it. And it's just a lot to
parents
process.
do the best they can.
All right, so let's rewind that because I want to hear those details. Let's rewind that.
I think just like the fact that I've always denied, like, I'm like, oh, my childhood was good because my parents were, they were busy. My mom was a single mom. I never saw her. She worked 4 jobs. And my dad would just put me to summer camp in the summer.
My mom was a single mom. I never saw her. She worked 4 jobs. And my dad would just put me in summer camps. Wow. And they're saying I was always in denial about my childhood. And I always thought my childhood was great. And that happens to kids who are neglected and abused, especially in this category where there's no overt signs of being mistreated. You might even look towards your cousins or your friends and think, oh, I got it better than you. But emotional attunement, for you out there who are parents, you understand this, that parenting is about putting in the time. It's about showing up. It's about being there, just hanging out. Kids playing, drawing a picture at the age of 7 and she says, hey, look what I drew. And you're like, oh, that looks great. Those are the moments. It's not about giving gifts or being there for birthday parties or, working for money to buy them a new toy or something. That is not parenting. Parenting is about, kids, they want to be with you. They want to be in earshot or, your visual. They want to be seen by you. They want to be noticed by you. They want to be able to come to you when they need you. They get scared at the age of 4 on the playground. They want to run back to you and, are you there? And then you say, yeah, I'm here. You're okay. You're doing all right. And then they go back. Those, that rinse and repeat every day. And of course, that's how we evolved, right? When 100,000 years ago, 50,000, even a couple hundred years ago, children weren't, parents didn't go away usually. The parents were right there all the time throughout everything. And so that's our natural state. And that's how our emotions adapted. We need that. And so I feel really bad for Trisha. Trisha sounds like they were completely on their own, like a wild child. Mom, I never saw my mom. She worked 4 jobs. I would see my dad sometimes and for the summers, and he would put me in summer camp. So to the 3-year-old, one, that's horrible for a lot of reasons that I don't have time to go into. But one of the conclusions that you can derive from that is I'm not lovable. And in order for me to get my needs met, I have to scream. And also, you can retain this notion of all bad or all good, which maybe they'll get into. Let's watch.
So I always don't want my parents, because I've talked about this recently and everyone's like, well, your parents should be in jail and all this stuff like that. And I was just like, I just don't want anyone to like get hate about it. And
Yeah, that's got to be tough for a public figure like Trisha to talk openly about what they went through. Would possibly cause maybe even doxing of the parents. And Trisha doesn't want that. So Trisha's trying to ride that line somehow. Also, I found that people who go through mistreatment, depending on the situation, will sometimes idealize their parents. Who knows about Trisha, but for people who go through what Trisha went through, sometimes what they will do, they're 2 years old, they're 7 years old, and they long for their parents. But they're hurt and they're angry, but they long for their parents. And so when their parents show up, they want to blast their parents. They want to say, how come you're never there for me? How come you're always putting me in summer camp? And maybe they even kind of do, but it doesn't work. It causes even more rejection. So then they learn, I have to suppress. I can't be angry at them, because if I'm angry, I'll never get any of my needs met. So the very few times that I see them, it's sort of like you're in solitary confinement in a prison, and the prison worker comes by and gives you food, and you're so angry because they haven't fed you well enough. And so you say, how come you're not feeding me enough? And then the prison guard says, well, fine, I guess I won't feed you at all today. So then you learn, I can't complain, because complaining just causes things to be even worse for me. It's already bad, but complain makes it worse. But I still feel the feelings. So how do I deal with that? Well, push comes to shove, I just get rid of the feelings, or I deny the feelings, or I develop a fantasy about what's happening. And so I tell myself, no, my parents are good. My parents are good. My parents are good. Then I won't get frustrated. Then I won't have to control my emotions. And then I will get that little bit of the little crumbs of attachment and love that I am happening to get right now. I don't know if that's what Trisha went through, but I've seen that in my office. A lot of people come in with this narrative that things were great. Parents are great. But I never saw my dad because, I only saw him in the summertime, and then he would always put me in summer camp. I never saw my mom because she worked 4 different jobs. And when she came home, she was too busy for me. But my childhood was great.
It's just a lot to process.
Parents do the best they can. Parents do the best they can. When you blame, if we were to blame your mom for this, for instance, I mean, now we have another victim, your mom.
Yeah.
Right. And
I don't agree with that. Dr. Drew is entitled to his own point of view, but it's not victimizing to place blame on people. Now, in all likelihood, the parents of Trisha had their own issues and their own childhood problems. So the blame probably goes back generations upon generations, or maybe even back to some some families. When you go back a couple generations, 3 generations, there was a war, there was refugees, there was famine that challenged the parents, and then that attachment disruption gets passed down through the generation. Anyway, so to attribute blame to the parents, which, given what we've heard from Trisha, I think would be rational. I mean, at least the dad, for not being there. It sounds like he could have been there. Anyway, now the dad was probably abandoned or neglected when he was a kid too, but it's still the dad's quote unquote fault, or at least the factors that went into Trisha's personality began in childhood, which was largely engineered by the parents. So we can certainly quote unquote blame the parents. I don't think that's victimizing the parents. Now, if you, and my dogs are barking, if you blame them on the air and then the entire internet comes down on your parents, then that is victimizing the parents. But Dr. Drew is saying something else that is, well, parents do the best that they can. And often that's true. But I think for the Trishas of the world, they deserve some kind of, this isn't your fault. You were treated poorly. Now, we could say that it's not your parents' fault that they treated you poorly because they were treated poorly when they were kids and so on. But it definitely isn't your fault that this happened. You were treated badly. Do we blame the parents for that? Do we just say it was a factor in the development of your personality? But the general thing that maybe Dr. Drew will save himself, but he's saying, we don't want to blame the parents because we don't want to victimize the parents. Huh? I don't make any sense.
It's so shattering to them to think that they allowed to happen to you what was so horrible for them. It really is difficult. So I sort of admire your attempt to sort of understand your parents' point of view and not blame them. Doesn't make it okay. It's not like okay that happened. Nothing's okay about this, but we don't have to have another victim.
Okay. I don't know. That victim word just isn't resonating with me. The rest of it, I can agree with what Dr. Drew was saying. But this attributing cause to the parents, I don't think that's victimizing the parents. Now, I don't know if Dr. Drew is interpreting Trisha correctly. Trisha is saying, I don't like to think about my childhood. I don't remember a lot of my childhood. I was neglected as a child, but I went into denial about how terrible my childhood was. And I don't want everyone to hate my, it sounds to me like Trisha recognizes that their childhood was bad because other people are hearing it and saying, you should have called the police back then. That's awful, neglect. And we have to imagine that there's much more details to what these other people heard that would prompt them to say, you should have called the police. So what I hear Trisha saying is, I was neglected in an almost criminal way, according to other people, but I've been kind of in denial about it. And I also don't want the internet to attack my parents. So what I'm not hearing from Trisha is Trisha saying, I don't want to blame my parents. What I do hear Trisha saying is, I kind of think it was my parents' fault. And for Dr. Drew to say, don't blame your parents, I'm glad you're not blaming your parents. I don't know if he's really syncing with Trisha right now, but who knows? By the way, whenever I comment on these kinds of things, it's so easy for me to criticize because I'm not under pressure. You know, I can pause this right now, go to the bathroom, chill out, hang out with my barking dogs. Dr. Drew can't do that. He's on live TV. And when I've been under those circumstances, I crumble and I make a lot of mistakes that Dr. Drew could criticize me for.
And bringing it up one time at the place that it happened, and you know, it started at a young age. I just remember everyone calling me a liar from a young age. So at some point, you just stop talking about things because you're just like, and that's kind of where I'm at even now. Like I was opened up about it. I'm like, let me just shut back down again because I'm just talking about the internet. Obviously, in therapy, I'm trying to talk about it, but like on the internet, I'm like, let me just stop talking about this because like it doesn't feel good.
I think for whatever reason, there are certain public figures who just are easy targets for bullying and for hate, and Trisha fits that mold, that persona. Kim Kardashian is another person that I think incurs a lot of hate and a lot of bullying online. I don't know that for sure, obviously. But they're also saying that they lied or that they were accused of lying a lot as a kid, and they are continuing to be accused of lying on the internet today. So what does that mean? Who knows? But it's possible that they aren't aware of the fact that they're lying. And as Dr. Drew said earlier, lying is volitional. You're trying to deceive. If you're just messing things up due to misremembering or due to your own disorders, that's not lying. That's messing things up. That's getting distorted. So I wonder what that's about. Trisha's saying that they were accused of lying a lot as a kid and as an adult. Is that a misperception on other people's part, or is it something that's happening that they're doing that is lying, but it's out of their awareness? Let's find out.
Fine. Like, you know, as soon as I snap out of it, I snap out of it.
So let me, people are questioning my training for being able to talk to you about these issues. Let's be clear. I am not treating Trisha. I am exploring her borderline process. I personally treated 2,000 or 3,000 borderline patients.
Oh, Dr. Drew, never read the comments, especially those. I've been there before. This random accusation, you know, people on the internet, there's a certain class, and they're a minority for sure, of people who just love to say, you're unqualified, you don't know what you're talking about. And they don't provide any evidence. And back in the day, when I first started this podcast 13 years ago, I would respond. I'd be like, what do you mean? What did I say that indicated to you I didn't have enough experience to talk about this sort of thing? And they would never have anything to say. Or they'd criticize a little bit. I'd be like, well, okay, you can disagree with me on that, but how does that call my whole qualification into question? And then I would feel compelled to justify, I'm a professor. It's like, but Dr. Drew is falling into that trap. And you'd think by now, Dr. Drew, having been in this kind of industry, I think for 30 plus years, pretty long time, because back in the Los Angeles days, he was with K-Rock or something. You'd think he'd be over it, but he feels the need to justify his credentials, which I've been there before. Let's just put it that way.
All the other times in her life, they want to focus on the bad moments, the worst possible pieces that you can clip out. It's like, look, Trisha, the way that you are now, it's like you're calm, you're composed, you're talking about your mental illness, you're talking about your struggles, and you're being very open with it. Whereas most people, myself included, I wouldn't feel even comfortable coming on.
Okay, so they're talking about how Trisha incurs a lot of hate on the internet. I don't know if it's fair or not. I could imagine that a lot of it is not fair. And I often try to figure this out. Why do some people on the internet, or why do just some subjects, like I do reaction videos for a 90 Day Fiancé. And a lot of people, if they're going to talk about that show, even in person, I'll experience that they just want to make fun of the people. They want, oh, that person's stupid. This person's a joke. I hate that person. That person's ugly. And I wonder why that is, because we don't do that with our family members, hopefully. We don't do that with our friends, hopefully. We don't do that with our coworkers, hopefully. We don't even do it necessarily with someone we see at the grocery store, hopefully. But something about these public figures, all of our anger and our judgment and our childishness, if you will, comes out at these individuals. And I wonder why that is. And they're trying to figure it out. Dr. Drew is saying maybe it's Trisha's fault because Trisha has borderline personality disorder and is projecting some of this all good, all bad thing. I don't know if that makes any sense to me. I'll tell you something from my life that I think pertains. So I've kept all of my yearbooks. They're behind me. I have all of my yearbooks from 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th, all the way through 12th. And every, 5 years or so, I'll kind of flip through them. And one of the things that I'll see immediately that I'm ashamed of is my 7th grade yearbook. So if you're not from the States, you don't have this. Yearbooks are these things you get at the end of the school year that have all of the pictures and pictures of sports, and it's just a big book that exemplifies that year of school and all the students and teachers and staff and everything. And one of the things that you do with these yearbooks is you sign other people's yearbooks. Give me your yearbook, and you sign, hey, have a good summer, stay cool, I signed your crack, that kind of thing, and you give it back to them. And then do people still do that? My 7th grade yearbook, I went through my own class, my fellow 7th graders, and wrote on maybe 10% an insult or a praise on certain people that I knew. I went through with some people and be like, they're a jerk face, they're ridiculous, they're stupid, they're dumb, they're an idiot. I did that, and then with other people that I liked, I'd be like, cool person, cool person, cool person. In 8th grade, nothing like that. 7th grade, apparently I was a completely different sort of person. 8th grade, didn't do that. And actually, my dad got a video camera when I was in, I think, 5th or 6th grade. When I was in 7th grade, I was a jerk face. But why was I a jerk face? I was massively insecure as a 7th grader, just all up in my head, And because I was insecure, and because I didn't know where I was, I didn't know where to put my hands, kind of a thing, when you're standing on stage, you don't know where to put your hands. I displaced my self-hatred into my yearbook. And I went through and said, I hate that person, and I'm going to publicly state. Because the other thing is, I would hand this yearbook out to other people. They would look at who I said was a hated person and who I said was a cool person. So I was public to some extent about this. This is awful. 8th grade didn't do that. And what correlates? Well, I wasn't as insecure as I was as a 7th grader. 7th grade, very insecure. 8th grade, something happened developmentally or socially or something, and I became more of who I would eventually become. But 7th grade, very insecure. Okay. When you're insecure, when you have self-hatred, I think a very pleasing thing to do is to judge and criticize someone else, right? Call someone a name. I'm going to publicly humiliate that person. Certain public figures, reality TV people, YouTube people, I think particularly women, because we live in a massively misogynistic society. I hope everyone understands that. And we live in a mental health stigmatizing society, a gender fluid stigmatizing society, transphobic society, that anyone who steps forward as a woman, as a strong woman, as a successful woman, as a person who talks about gender issues, as a person who talks about their feelings, it just pulls together all of the 7th graders among us who might not be 7th graders anymore, who are massively insecure, and they're sad, and they're struggling, and they're just trying to get some semblance of self-esteem. And if they push someone else down, it elevates them kind of. It doesn't solve their problem, but it distracts them just for a second. Particularly if someone's being bullied. One of the things that I hope you never had to observe, but I'm guessing a lot of you did, is some people just get targeted. That one kid just gets targeted by not only just the bullies, but kind of by everybody. Why is that? Well, because once someone is established by society as the bully, as the scapegoat, then we all kind of turn on that person because they're an easy target, and we know that they can't fight back with us because they can't fight back on all of us because we're all kicking them. And so if I just walk up to someone and call them a bad name and I'm the only one, they might come after me. But if 10,000 people are calling someone a bad name, I could sort of pile on and, get my dig in, and I can feel better about myself, and there won't be any repercussions. I think the Trishas of the world represent that to us, that they get designated socially, and they might kind of present themselves in a way that make them easy targets. Not that I'm victim blaming, but there's certain qualities that can be managed that will make you less of a target. Who knows? And as a society, we turn on that person, and collectively, we all feel a little bit better than ourselves. But what the real cure is to help people with their relational trauma such that they don't feel terrible about themselves, such that they don't have to act like a 7th grader. Hashtag not all 7th graders.
You, but I don't know if it stayed with you. And that is that people with borderline process, and we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes, by the way. I want to warn you about that. We're going to take a little commercial break. But
Okay.
we have, you use something called projective identification, which is you will put your feelings into other people.
Interesting. I don't know if I've ever had an opportunity to react to someone else talking about projective identification in one of my YouTube videos. It's something that I've been using this concept and this defense mechanism of projective identification for years. I've been lecturing about it. I've been talking about it on the podcast. One of the very first episodes that I ever did that you can find, I think, on YouTube is about projective identification. Maybe it's not on YouTube. Anyway, it's a central concept that I use. I use it to understand a lot of different weird human relationship behaviors. So Dr. Drew is bringing up projective identification, and it sounds like what he's saying is that he is saying that for people with borderline, people like Trisha, that they will inject feelings into other people, which is one way to say it. Let's see what Dr. Drew says here.
And then manipulate them. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. You'll like accuse the other person of having an emotion, or you actually feel an emotion coming from another person that is actually something in you don't like, and you sort of see it in the other person or put it in the other person.
Okay, yeah. So I don't know if I would word it this way to Trisha. I would say, if I were there, I would say, so there's this thing called projective identification. We all do it, not just you, Trisha, not just those with borderline, but we all engage in projective identification to some degree. People with personality disorders often do it a lot more, particularly with people with borderline, narcissism, histrionic, will do it a lot more than other people, but we all do it. So what is Dr. Drew talking about? Well, what he's talking about, I think, is this process that we learned early, or we maybe have the capacity for when we're young. Anyway, I won't go into the weeds on that. So when we feel challenged, well, how do I discuss it? It's such a complicated topic. Okay, it's essentially, and this is how I summarize it for my students, it's essentially a recreation of a relationship. That's sort of the easiest way of conceptualizing it and remembering it. Projective identification is the active recreation. It's unconscious. It's an active, unconscious recreation of a past relationship that was often very difficult for us. So we're criticized as children, and we internalize this relationship. And this is how I describe it, because it's helpful to think of it as dyads. That I perceive the other as being critical, I perceive the self as being criticized, and I internalize that relationship. Because you're not only observing the other person, but you're kind of observing the self. And so you internalize that whole relationship as a dyad. It exists within us and within our psyche, and left to our own devices, we will beat ourselves up, and we will feel like we are, we will do this we'll talk bad to ourselves, and we will feel bad. So we'll continue to recreate that relationship that we internalized internally. I think most of us could identify with that. But internally, it makes it much harder to deal with, because this self voice is very difficult. Plus, we don't want to identify with this voice, even though it is us. We're telling the self, you're a terrible person, you're a piece of crap. But we don't want to identify with this voice because we saw it outside of it and we don't like it, but it's become us. So we will also criticize other people, but we'll deny it that we're criticizing other people. We'll say, well, I'm just telling the truth, or I'm not being mean, but the other person is absolutely receiving it in the same way that we received it when we received it. So we don't want to admit that about ourselves, though. So one of the ways to protect the ego from having to admit that we will not only criticize, because someone criticizes us, we internalize that, we criticize the self, we criticize other people, but we don't want to admit that. So how do we protect the ego from acknowledging that we are in fact the criticizer, just like they were in the past? Is we will accuse other people and socialize other people to criticizing us. So you say, look, you're criticizing me. And so in effect, I'm projecting what I internalized from my past. I'm identifying with me. I'm projecting the other onto someone else. I'm socialized. I might even choose someone that's a little critical. I project it onto them. I see them as critical, even though they're not being critical. I socialize them to be critical. I sort of force them to be, maybe I act in a criticizable way to suck them into criticizing me. And thus I've made the internal external. And we do this for a lot of different reasons. One, it's more comfortable if it's external because it's harder if it's us doing it to us. Two, we can deny that part of ourselves that's critical because, look, it's happening on the outside. Three, it is a model for attachment. When the person was criticized against in the past, that's how we equated the criticism with attachment and love. And so when we're in a relationship, it feels natural to have some sort of critical element because it was normal to us. It's very normalized. And the fourth reason why we do it is because we're trying to work it out. It didn't work out in the past. We never had a good comeback. We never became acceptable to the other person completely. And so we recreate it in this unconscious way, hoping that we can work it out somehow so the criticizer will actually accept us and not criticize us. But of course, if it's all out of our awareness, we might be so good at choosing a critical person and so good at socializing them to be critical of us that the trauma continues. So not only were we experiencing criticism when we were a child, but now we've engineered it in our personal life currently, and they're continuing to criticize us, which reinforces this dyad inside of us, which gives us more reason to use projective identification in the future. Does that make sense to people? So for people with borderline, they also use projective identification. And what they internalized was abandonment and betrayal, right? Often rejection. So they're being betrayed and they feel betrayed. So they internalize that relationship. So they have the betrayer and the betrayed, and they betray themselves a lot of times. They'll reject themselves. They will also betray other people, but they will be unconscious about it because they don't want to admit it about themselves, that they are in fact the betrayer because they internalize the betrayer. So they will socialize other people, including maybe their therapist, that they will find people, but even if they can't find someone, they will they will project onto that person and see that person as being betraying of them, even though they're not being, or they might socialize the other person to betray them somehow, kind of force them to betray him. And then they'll say, hey, you're betraying me, even though it was originally this past betrayer, and secondarily it was them as the betrayer, and now they're just forcing someone else to become the betrayer. So I think that's what Dr. Drew was talking about. Does that make sense to people?
Sound familiar?
I've heard that. I've heard that I do that, and I can't recognize that. But I obviously have heard that from a lot of people. Yeah.
Okay, so what that is when somebody is in the room with you, they'll feel something unpleasant, and if they're attuned to themselves, they'll feel like that unpleasant feeling isn't a part of themselves. Like, where did that come from?
Right. So this is something that I don't frame it this way, but it is one way to put it. When you are a clinician working with someone with borderline or narcissism or histrionic, you will feel feelings that are very intense as a clinician, as a therapist. You will feel fear. You will feel like you're a bad person. You will feel fragile. And the one way of putting it is that it's the borderline patient injecting you, socializing you to feel those feelings, because through projective identification, that process I was discussing, they're injecting feelings into you. They're socializing you to feel a certain way. When you're afraid, you want to reject, right? When someone makes you afraid, you want to run away, right? And so the borderline individual might inject fear into you subtly by treating you a certain way or insulting you in a certain way or having a certain intensity of language. It's all subconscious, by the way. The borderline individual has no control over this. It's just, and none of us do. None of us have control. And the idea is to try to help to have control over it through awareness. But anyway, and by subtly doing these things to the therapist now feels terribly afraid. It's one of the central features of treating people with narcissism or borderline or histrionic is the sense of fear that you will feel. And this requires a lot of self-awareness on the behalf of the therapist and a lot of therapy that the therapist has to go through, because what often happens without that process of therapy and personal knowledge that a therapist gains is they will feel the fear, but they won't recognize it. They'll recognize the sentences that go through their mind of, I don't want to work with this person. This client is too resistant. This client is not working well in therapy. I'm going to refer them out to someone else. I'm not qualified to work with this client. I'm going to refer them out. And a lot of people with borderline get shuffled from therapist to therapist because the therapist is not aware, my guess is they're not aware of how to notice those feelings and how to accept it and how to normalize it. Because when you're treating someone with borderline, you're going to feel afraid because they're going to use projective identification with you, as all clients do, by the way. And their projection is the way that they felt when they were 3. They were terrified when they were 3. Trisha, I don't know, but we could imagine Trisha being 3 years old, mom is working 4 jobs, and Trisha never sees their mom. Trisha never sees their dad because dad is gone, and only when Trisha does see dad sends Trisha away to a summer camp. When you're alone like that at the age of 3, you're afraid, you're terrified, you're alone, you feel betrayed, you're angry, you're lonely, you feel abandoned. So that's been internalized, and then they will project that into other people, and then now you feel abandoned, now you feel afraid, now you feel like there's something wrong with you, you don't know what to do. And unless you get to know that feeling as a therapist and have your own process, your own therapist, your own consultation, your own self-awareness countertransference management system, then you're going to have these thoughts of, I need to get rid of this client. And it's one of the tragedies of my field is that a lot of people who need therapy the most, people with borderline, histrionic, narcissism, are rejected the most. And with every trainee that I've worked with, they almost always, and hopefully they do, will run into someone who has borderline or narcissism or histrionic. And this is the crucible that makes the therapist. They can either, as trainees, give into the fear and say, I'm not going to work with those people, which is up to them. You know, it's a decision you can make, and sometimes people make it, and I guess that's okay. But what I tell people as they're going through it is, you know that people come to therapy because they have problems, right? And that sounds ridiculous, right? It's like, yeah, of course people come to therapy, but there's this fantasy that a lot of trainees will have, a lot of novice therapists will have, that all of their clients will love them, that every client will be easy, that all you have to do is just provide this service, this wonderful, loving service, and the clients will just eat it up and everything, and you'll love each other and everything will be great. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes people come to therapy because they have legit relationship problems, and they will distort their vision of you, and they will be very, very scared of you and also very angry at you because they're transferring and they're displacing their past onto you. All that we understand, we intellectually understand. But when novice therapists experience it, they don't want to do it. And I get it, it is hard. But through that process, you become the therapist that you will become. You will overcome that, and you will say, okay, I accept that into it's not going to be easy. My dissertation, my research study was on seasoned therapists' experience with difficult clinical moments. And a lot of so these are therapists that are 15 plus years into their career. And I would ask them about their difficult clinical moments. And a lot of them described experiences with clients who had borderline. And it's intense. It is and the themes that I found in the reactivity were a fight or flight reaction, a like deer in headlights reaction, a lot of fear, a feeling of deep, deep confusion, a feeling of anger at the client, a feeling of wanting to run out of the room, or a feeling of wanting to terminate the client, or a feeling of wanting to quit the profession altogether, a feeling of wanting to hide your feelings, and there was a sixth theme that I'm forgetting. Anyway, but those are a lot of intense feelings. So what Dr. Drew is talking about is that injection of that feeling through transference. I wish Dr. Drew would say that everyone does this, not just Trisha and those with borderline.
It came from Trisha. That's part of borderline disorder, is that you can do that. Yeah. And again, that's what I think is happening with you in the world. Like, you're projecting a part of yourself into the world, and they're all responding to it with this split, this good-bad split.
I don't like this argument at all. So Trisha is incurring, from the descriptions, who knows, I don't know, a lot of bullying and abuse from people online. And according to Dr. Drew, this is Trisha's fault, because Trisha has borderline, and as a product of borderline, injects feelings into other people. It's absolutely possible, I will go with Dr. Drew, that it's absolutely possible that if Trisha, and Trisha says that they have borderline, that given their relational traumas and their transference issues and their projective identification proclivities, will socialize individuals in the room with them and even people on the internet to feeling certain feelings. And that might result in Trisha being attacked. I'll go with Dr. Drew on that. On the other hand, without some major asterisk there of it's not really your fault and people can decide to be a jerk face or not. And actually, this brings up another important thing that I talk about with my trainees is the Trishas of the world will use projective identification with the therapist or with an audience. But us as therapists, we also have our own histories. We're not blank slates. We're not, perfectly attached individuals. So we have our own traumas. We have our own projective identification. And so as my clients are using projective identification with me, I am simultaneously using projective identification with them. I have my own relational traumas. I have my own internalized relationships. I have my own things that I'm displacing and transferring onto my clients. That's why we call it counter-transference. Sometimes I'll just call it literal transference because, anyway, I won't go to the weeds on that. But so with Trisha, they might be socializing the audience to abandon them and to feel a rejection of them in the same, so the model goes that Trisha was abandoned and neglected as a child and internalized that relationship and then abandons the self and the self feels abandoned. And then through projective identification projects the abandoner out into the world and socializes others and maybe even finds others that are susceptible to this projection to reject them and then re-experiences that betrayal and that abandonment. It's absolutely possible with an audience, but at the very same time, not because of, but simultaneously, the audience has their own problems. Because when I see Trisha, I don't want to reject them. I don't want to abandon them. But if I have unprocessed and I have unhealed problems from my past that result in these internal wars, that results in my need for externalizing the internalized relationship, i.e. projective identification, then Trisha and I might very well sync up with our projective identifications where Trisha seeks my approval and I don't approve. And I very actively watch Trisha on YouTube and actively abandon and reject and criticize and betray them. It's an interesting hypothesis.
Wow. That's interesting. So how do the last friend of me was literally that. He was like, you're getting angry. I'm like, I'm not angry. And then I started getting angry because he's like, you're angry and that's okay. And I'm like, but I'm not angry. So then everyone was like, he's like, you're gaslighting me. So then it becomes like, but how do I stop it? Like, I really didn't feel angry in the moment. And then I got angry and then I was like, well, what the hell? Like, how do I?
Yeah, that's interesting. From the outside, when I saw that video, obviously Trisha knows themselves much better than I would from the outside. But when I saw that conflict between Trisha and Ethan, it did look like Trisha was angry. Now, is anger the best word for it? Was it frustrated? Was it upset? Was it off-put or something? Who knows? But Trisha did look upset and didn't look terribly upset. And in the moment, I wondered why Trisha was denying being upset. Trisha had a lot of reasons to be upset. They were under the impression that they were being exploited. They were feeling as though Ethan wasn't listening or was being hurtful or something. So there's reasons to be hurt and angry. And at the time, Trisha was denying it. So on one hand, we'll take Trisha's word for it that they weren't angry and they were confused as to why Ethan kept saying that. And then the word gaslighting comes into play. They both claimed that they were, and listen to my episode on gaslighting, where I actually talk about that incident. And so there's that. But let's go with the model of projective identification, where Trisha was angry at the time, but wanted to engage in projective identification. Who knows? It's a long shot. So it goes like this, where who knows, this is just one way of seeing it, is that Trisha experienced as a child someone being angry at them. Maybe it was when Trisha was being demanding and saying, love me, how come you're not paying attention to me? And there's anger or something. And that gets internalized where there's an angry, unfair person and a person who is kind of the victim of that subtle anger. Maybe even has this element of I'm not angry, where Trisha as a child is saying, how come you're angry at me? And the parent's like, I'm not angry at you. I kind of feel like you're angry at me. I'm not angry. So there's some kind of anger plus denial aspect to it. So that gets internalized. And then there's the self, the perception of the self that feels confused and feels threatened, but feels like the person is lying about the anger. Anyway, so there's that internalized relationship. Then and it becomes difficult. And through projective identification, someone in Trisha's shoes could socialize someone to feel. So that's why I have the dyad, because sometimes we project the other, but sometimes we project the self image, and we identify with the other. So maybe what Trisha did is they projected the other, how Trisha felt when Trisha was a child, onto Ethan, and identified with the other and became angry but in denial of the anger, and made Ethan feel the way Trisha did when Trisha was a child. That happens a lot. And then by injecting this feeling of confusion into Ethan, Ethan then becomes kind of angry and then says, hey, and starts to attack in the same way that the person, anyway, it's complicated, but I'll get into the weeds if I go too far down. I hope this is interesting because I don't know if any of y'all are following it. Let's get back to the show.
How do I not do that then? I don't know. I don't want to be that person.
Yeah. It was either him projecting anger onto you or him experiencing your anger that you hadn't felt yet. Isn't that interesting?
I had not felt it.
Isn't that crazy?
I swear on my life. Yeah. Because I was like, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm just having a conversation. And then by the end of it, I was.
That's the weird thing about that is the uncanny. If you do it borderline a lot,
So I don't know if this is what Dr. Drew was saying. I don't think he was. But Ethan also has projective identifications as well. I don't know what those are. But Ethan and Trisha will come together with both of their projective identification. And this is the pinnacle of my theoretical understanding of how people work, how their development works, is it's one thing to understand the complicated way in which we use projective identification ourselves. It's another thing to understand someone else's projective identification. But when we see them working together, that's when everything comes together, because we don't use projective identification in a vacuum. We use it with other people, and they are using it with us at the same time. And so my dog is barking. This is when I figured out the perfect integration of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic object relations theory, which is a very individualistic theory, with systems and family systems and Bowennian theory, because you have the intrapsychic and the interpersonal coming together. You have projective identification, which is motivated from inside. It starts from the outside, and then it comes from within. But then they work together and they happen all at the same time, reinforcing each other, which maybe I'll have time to go into, but I have definitely in past episodes.
But there's a lot to do, right? There's a lot of stuff, and you're taking it very seriously. You should be proud of yourself. I understand at one point you thought you might have dissociative identity disorder. Do you do a lot of dissociating?
Yeah. I call it blacking out, but I black out. Again, not recently, so I don't know.
Okay, so some of y'all know that I did a recent episode on dissociative identity disorder and people who are faking it online or supposedly faking it online. Listen to that mini deep dive on that. My take is that some people might be faking it. Some people might just be representing it in a weird way. And a lot of people seem to be representing their legit dissociative identity disorder condition. Also, there's some rumors that it's not a real thing and that everyone fakes it, and that is not true. None of the experts in dissociation in general, or none of the experts in psychopathology think that, or at least very few, think that it's a completely faked disorder. Something like 10 to 20%, according to research, of patients who present with DID are found to be quote unquote faking it. But people fake every disorder in the DSM. So that doesn't mean, and maybe they fake dissociative identity disorder more often, but it's still a minority of people. Plus, most people don't come into our offices complaining of DID. They will complain of the depression or the suicidality or the memory lapses, and they don't know they have DID. So it's not like it's common that people, use DID as some sort of tool to manipulate other people. And DID, when you actually work with people with dissociative identity disorder, it is a debilitating disorder, particularly in the beginning. It is awful. I mean, just imagine not remembering like a week of your life, and people say that you were doing things. It's awful. So what Trisha is talking about is that they had blackouts and self-diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. So what does that mean? Maybe they'll get into it with more detail, but it sounds like, and now they're not experiencing it anymore, which could mean that the triggers aren't there. Based on the very little that I just heard, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't suffer from a more general dissociative disorder in which, in general, and I go into more detail in other episodes, I've done full deep dives on various different dissociative disorders, but what happens is that when we're young, we seem to have this mechanism available to very young children that when we're being terrorized, when we're forced into a lot of fight or flight adrenaline reactions when we're children, and we're in scary situations, that we have this mechanism available to us at that age that helps us to distance ourselves from what's happening because we're stuck. So remember, we have fight, flight, freeze, appease, or faint. So when you're 3 years old, you can't really fight, you can't really run away. You can freeze, you can appease, and you can faint. And when you're doing one of those things, when you're freezing, one of the things that you can do is like, okay, I'm going to freeze, and I'm going to pull away from reality in my mind. I can't run away physically, but I can run away in my mind. So I'm being abused, and this is just going to happen. I don't have any power over it, but I can kind of separate myself. It's a subconscious thing that happens to kids. It's something that just happens naturally. And it's a good, useful thing to the 4-year-old because it helps them to get through the situation. The problem is that when you rinse and repeat that experience of dissociative defense and helpfulness when they're 4, it locks in that as a habit neurologically, and you're 35 and your boss is criticizing you and you dissociate. And you can't function, when you're in a dissociative state, it's very hard to function. You might not even remember what happened while you were in that, you might dissociate for an hour and not even remember what happened during that past hour. Based on the little bit that Trisha said, I'm guessing that more general dissociative. Now, a form of dissociation is actually having different alters, where one alter will experience the trauma, another alter will fight back, another alter will be nice at school, another alter will be the good kid with the friends, another alter will be the rebel, and this is a way of responding to very difficult times when you're young.
No, maybe it's the drug
Good.
you stopping. I don't know. Maybe there's something that helped it, but not recently. But yeah, I mean,
Good.
all the time I would just
Good.
remember or not remember what I said. So yeah.
And is that usually in a rage, or just can happen randomly?
Yeah. No, always in a rage. And
Okay, they're about to expand, but if it is only in a rage, then we could consider it a dissociative state. We could also consider it a PTSD state. And sometimes it's hard to differentiate between those two. But when people are triggered, when we have trauma and we haven't recovered from it because we haven't been through effective trauma recovery and therapy, or we just haven't recovered, then, and we'll be triggered, one of the responses is for the body to, so one way to think about it is that for people who have been through significant trauma, so say that you're abused or neglected or something and you're being attacked and it's highly traumatic and your psychology reacts to it in such a way that it can't integrate that memory into our personality or into our psyche or our long-term memory or something. It's a very difficult memory and we have a hard time dealing with it. So it kind of stays static is one of the ways that people think about it. And then 30 years later, that the vibe of that so imagine that you're 7 years old and you're being bullied by 3 kids at school. They're hitting you. And then the bullies suddenly run off and you're a friend and you run up to your 7-year-old friend and you're 7 and you say, "Oh my God, how you doing?" And you grab your friend and you try to pick him up and your friend punches you in the face. Not a good thing, but we understand that because your friend, the 7-year-old, is in a state of like, get away from me, and even though you're trying to help, they punch you. Okay. So if your trauma never gets resolved and you're 30 years later and someone comes along and starts to kind of poke at you and threaten you, then you will react as if that past trauma that happened 30 years ago just happened right now. And you just start swinging. And you're just, and you go into a state. It's almost like this different, in the same way that the 7-year-old kid who's being bullied and you walk up, they're not in their normal state. They're in a different state. Give them 5 minutes or 5 hours. They'll calm down. They'll take some deep breaths. They'll be in a different state. But right now they're in this highly reactive, almost animalistic state. Well, that's what PTSD can create as well. You can go to war and bring that back with you. You can bring it with you from childhood trauma. You can bring it with you from being bullied at work or at school or something. And I wonder, and so that can be experienced and be described as dissociative, but I would describe it more as a trauma reaction. But maybe Trisha will elaborate.
That's all I had was my stories, which are, true to what I remember and stuff. So, and as a kid, I think I started developing like lying, intentional lying, because people just didn't believe me anyway. So I would just like make up stuff. So I think I did as a child lie a lot. And then it got me into like really serious trouble as like a teenager. And so I was just like, okay, I need to not do that. But I was.
Okay, that's interesting. And I'm really glad that Trisha is able to admit that. What they're saying is when they were a child, they were accused of lying when they weren't lying. And that hurts to be accused. You're lying. And you're like, I'm not lying. And eventually you're just thinking, well, if I lie purposely, at least I have power over this accusation. It's similar to when you call a kid a bad kid. You're a bad kid. It's like, I'm a good kid. I'm trying to be good. And then eventually that kid's, well, screw it. If I'm going to be called bad, then I'm just going to act bad. Because at least if I'm going to be accused of something, at least I can say that I did it on purpose. Because to be accused of something that you didn't do, you are being treated unfairly and you feel powerless. But to bring it on, to lie and then cause people to say you're lying, you're being mistreated, but at least you're doing at least you can say that you have some power in the equation. And so Trisha is saying that that's what they did. They were being accused and then they decided that they would lie. And it, I'm guessing, gave Trisha a sense of power. And good for Trisha to be able to admit that. What can happen to people is that it'll set in this habit of what we call compulsive or pathological lying, where you're lying for no reason, even as an adult, when you're no longer in that context.
Before, the self-harm doesn't go with histrionic so much, right? You tried to hurt yourself?
Yeah. Well,
that's more
that was a
borderline.
time when Yeah. I mean, unintentionally, again, I don't think that was me. Yeah.
And let me ask this. And the other thing, it's associated with this, with a uncertain sense of who you are. Is that one of your things?
Okay, so they're talking about histrionic personality disorder, which is very similar to borderline, and some might even consider it a subset of borderline, or borderline a subset of histrionic, or histrionic and borderline subset of some other larger umbrella personality disorder label. But Drew is saying that with histrionic, you lack a sense of who you are. This is true for a lot of personality disorders, particularly borderline and histrionic. Dr. Drew seems to be differentiating the histrionic, the connection to the self, is a problem, and for borderline, it's not. Histrionic, narcissism, borderline, all narcissistic, did I say all have a problem with a disconnection of the self and a lack of this. We used to say lack of self, but really it's a lack of connection with the self, because there's definitely a self down there. I've talked about this before, but in brief, when we're young, we are not really aware of ourselves. A 6-month-old baby, a 18-month-old child doesn't really know their emotions. They don't really know who they are. They're not in connection with their needs. They're just very reactive. When they're sad, they cry. When they're happy, they laugh. But they have a hard time reflecting on who they are. They don't really know who they are. Their emotions just cause these signaling to other people, and other people hopefully react to them in a attuned way. But over time, what we're hoping for is that the child will learn to not just react, but also see themselves through other people's eyes. And that's how we help children, is that we reflect to a child. We say, oh, you're enjoying yourself. Oh, you're sad. Oh, you're sleepy. Oh, you're tired. Oh, you are enjoying that cookie. Oh, you're afraid of that dog. And you and it's more complicated than just saying, but it's being with the child as they go through their experiences. Asking a child, what do you want right now? How do you feel? Asking the child to reflect, and then being a containment for those feelings. And so the child learns through repetition to identify their needs and their emotions, such that when everything goes well and you're 35 years old and someone asks you, do you like your career? You're able to say, yes. How do we know that we like our career? Is there some kind of, a computer in our head that we just type in this question? No, we just have this sense. Well, how do we get a hold of that sense? How do we have a notion of that sense? Do I like my career or do I not like my career? We get that through that repetition when we're in that critical window between the ages of like 3 and 6, maybe a little bit beyond that, maybe a little bit before that, but it's around those years. And if you are not properly attuned to, as Trisha has discussed, how their parents were neglecting them, mom worked, Trisha said that they never saw their mom worked a lot. Trisha said never saw dad just sent Trisha off to summer school or summer camp. And so if you don't have that reflection and that time of learning, who am I, what do I want, how do I know my needs, then you can be in your adult life and be trying to meet your needs, because your needs are down there, the self is down there, your emotions, your needs are down there, but you can't see them. The analogy I give is you're looking into a bedroom and it's pitch black and it looks like it's empty, but it's not. You just have to turn up the light switch, and that's where therapy comes in. It's a therapy that involves getting in connection with that self, getting in connection with who I am. A lot of people who look into that room and it's dark, they think it's empty and they're terrified. A lot of people with personality disorders, borderline histrionic, when they look at the self, they see emptiness and that terrifies them. And I've been with people as they look into the abyss and they are very scared of it. But it's not an abyss. It's not black. It's just dark, and you have to turn up the light. There are things in there. You have needs. You are somebody. You have emotions. You're just not in connection with them. And so it takes practice. And it's the only way that you can have well-being, because only you know deep in your soul who you are and what you need and what you want. And you need to get in connection with that. And you need a relationship, a set of relationships around you that support you in your connection with that. You can't just look in. You have to have people asking you, what do you want? How do you feel? And be a safe environment to explore your own emotions and your own needs. So people with borderline histrionic narcissism lack that, because they lacked that critical period when they were young. And so I think that's what they're talking about.
Identity disorder, that was maybe where I got that more, because like I've always said this, and I'm not really sure if it's just like, I don't know who I am as a 33-year-old, but just I've always, and I think I talked about this before with you, where I just like cling to like famous people identities, or even the people I'm dating. I just try and become like the people around me, and my personality is constantly changing and my obsessions are changing.
Right, it's interesting. So in my research on the TikTok dissociative identity disorder phenomenon, I came across some people that were saying that they had dissociative identity disorder. I couldn't know if they did or they didn't. But they were also saying that one of their alters was a famous person. Like they were literally Oprah Winfrey or Ryan Reynolds or Barack Obama or something. And that was, they were them. And when they would say, okay, now my Barack Obama alter is fronting, they would act like Barack Obama. And that is possible. I will say, in the people that I've treated with dissociative identity disorder, I didn't see that. I could see that happening. I don't know. I can't assess over TikTok. But what Trisha is talking about is much more easily understood by me, because I have seen this, where because you lack that sense of self, you will look outward because you're looking for something to guide your behavior, something to give you meaning in life, because you don't even know how to imagine. Because everyone eventually, most people fall into a career of some kind. Well, imagine if you just sort of fall into it and you're doing all these things. You're going to church, you're having kids, you're going to a job, and you have no way of knowing, is this what I want? I see other people doing these things and they seem to want this, and I'm doing it, but do I want it? Everyone else seems to think that this is fulfilling. Is it fulfilling? How do I even know it's fulfilling? Does it feel fulfilling? So it's sometimes easier just to adopt another person's motivations and meanings. So you might do that with a spouse or a best friend or a famous person. And it's something to land on. It doesn't ultimately help because the random likelihood that your vision of a famous person will align with your needs is pretty slim. The chance of that's pretty slim, but that is a motivation for it, and could be misinterpreted as a dissociative identity disorder when in fact it's just a desperation of it's a desperate defense in response to a lack of connection with the self. All right, well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.